Welcome, Texas. Hello from Washington, D.C. I'm Jason Gross, Executive Director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It is good to join with you together today. Typically, this is the season where I'm traveling all over the country and getting to see you in person. I really miss that, but we're very glad that we have at least the opportunity to connect this way. First off, and most importantly, I want to offer my sincere hope that you and your families are safe and healthy today. I'm very pleased to be joined today by what will be eventually 100 participants from Texas for this important discussion on America's role in the world in the midst of COVID-19 and why leading globally impacts us locally. Living proof right now as we're living through today. This is an important conversation. We're honored to have Congressman Joaquin Castro with us. We'll welcome him officially to the Zoom in a minute. Some quick logistics for everyone joining us today. You're all on mute now, but we do want to hear from you later. And when I open up the Q&A, there are a couple of ways to ask questions. On your computers, you can hit the raise hand function, or if you're joining us by phone, dial *9 and we can call on you. And if you prefer to write, you'll find the Q&A box to type in your questions and we can answer them that way. Before we get into our conversation today, we have some new faces and names joining us today. I want to let you a little bit more a reminder about who we are of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, where we are proud to celebrate 25 years of building a better, safer world. And I want to tell you a little bit more about us. We're over 500 American businesses and humanitarian organizations, alongside our network of business, faith, military, community leaders from across the country. Our bipartisan advisory council is chaired by Secretary Colin Powell, is made up of our nation's top national security and foreign policy leaders, including most every living former Secretary of State. Our National Security Advisory Council is co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Tony Zinni, and is comprised of over 200 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers. Our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is made up of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. And what brings all of these diverse voices together is a firm belief that we live in an interconnected world and that America needs to be engaged globally to advance our interests here at home. We talk about why a tiny 1% of the federal budget, called the U.S. International Affairs budget, is one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments America makes. It's sometimes called the foreign aid budget, but we know it's so much more than that. It funds our diplomats and embassies abroad, support for our key allies. It's our efforts to tackle global health threats, humanitarian disasters, impacts of climate change, and the root causes of terrorism. It's our work to combat corruption, promote the rule of law, advance democracy and universal rights and freedoms. And it's our programs that open up new markets for the export of American goods and services, and private-public partnerships that are providing a hand up, not a handout, to millions around the globe. It's effective, it's accountable, it's transparent, and it delivers for the American people. Now, we host forums like this all over the country, and we see that across political spectrums and state lines, Americans like you want to engage. COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of this fight, and we are so fortunate to be joined by an expert in Congress to help us think through this. It is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, whom you all know, Congressman Joaquin Castro. He is hard at work to address the challenge of the pandemic over the past months and keep Texans safe. As you know, Congressman Castro is the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, chair of the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee, and a member of the House Intelligence Committee. And he is a leading voice when it comes to advancing America's global leadership. From his work in Congress to his travels overseas, he knows firsthand the value of investing in America's development and diplomacy programs. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. First off, most importantly, how are you and your family doing today?
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me, and thanks for help convening all of us. I'm doing well. You know, except for going to vote up in Congress a few times now, I've been back home with my family, been inside probably 95% of the time. and also been doing a lot of work for constituents who obviously are dealing with both a public health emergency and also, for many of them, a financial crisis, a personal financial crisis for their families. And so thank you. Thank you very much for hosting.
A challenging time, but before we dive into today's discussion, would love to offer you a chance to deliver some opening remarks, a few words before we dive into our discussion.
Sure. No, absolutely. Well, first, thank you everybody for joining. I know that it's mostly Texans on the call, so I feel at home. I've been here at home in San Antonio since about mid-March, as I mentioned. Thank you to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, Jason, and the leadership of the group, and everybody who worked so hard in a bipartisan way to make sure that the infrastructure of diplomacy in the United States and for the United States around the world is strong. I believe that just as we have been in past generations, that in future generations and in the present day, the United States must remain a leader in terms of democracy, freedom, and human rights for people around the world. And let me give a little context before we get started on the pandemic, on COVID-19, and obviously its effect on the United States and the world, and what's going on in Congress. Let's take a look. Let's think a little bit about what was going on before this pandemic hit. Over the last few years, Europe has still been dealing with a huge migration issue on its own. Over the last 5 years or so, have been dealing with the largest migration issue that it's faced since World War II. The United States has also faced its own migration issues. Hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million folks from the northern tribal countries of Central America, many of them fleeing very violent, desperate situations, have tried to make their way to the United States. You still have nations that are facing famine and starvation, and folks migrating for those reasons. You have leaders who in their own nations have been very abusive of their people. I would put Duterte in the Philippines, for example, and in some respects Erdogan in that category. You have the emergence of both popular leaders or populist leaders on the left and the right. In Brazil, for example, you have Bolsonaro, who has been a leader that is very much on the right and has been controversial there. And you have the United States facing an emerging competitor in China. China, over the last many years, has been building out in the South China Sea, has been more antagonistic towards Japan and towards some of the nations of ASEAN, for example. They've introduced their Belt and Road Initiative, which is an aggressive, both economic, but also a military plan for their own future. So you've got nations and continents facing very deep challenges, the competitiveness of the world continuing to grow in a way that in the last 20 or 25 years, or really almost 30 years now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we had not seen as a country and as a world. So the world has grown more competitive economically, militarily, and otherwise. So that is the context in which we find ourselves just before this pandemic hits. That, of course, is a truncated version, but that's where we find ourselves. And as you all know, this pandemic has hit just about every nation of the world, and for many nations, laid us flat. What I mean by that is this has been a very special and unique time in American history where as much as you can imagine, for a period of time, things stopped. The economy stopped. People stopped going outside. People stopped interacting with each other. The United States is at a point right now where it is more closed off to the world than it perhaps has ever been, and certainly than it has seldom ever been. What do I mean by that? Right now, for example, there are no naturalization ceremonies going on. Nobody can get a green card in the United States. No asylum seekers can seek asylum right now in the United States. And so this pandemic has been not only a public health emergency, and over 90,000 Americans now have perished because of it, but also for families, a financial emergency. And in many ways, politically and in terms of diplomacy, has also mixed things up. Very quickly, before I turn it back over to Jason, because I know we're going to have some Q&A and then open it up. What I hope, and I think what many of us hope, whether we're Republican or Democrat, is first, we hope that all of the measures that we've been taking, all of the staying at home, all of the social distancing, all of the research that has gone into a vaccine, that the measures taken by individuals, the research done by companies and others will pay off, that we'll successfully defeat this thing, that we can defeat it in the United States, but also that we can be a leading part of the nations who help defeat this thing across the world. Because that's what we've always been. We've always been a country that is a leader of nations, not only when it comes to bringing peace, but also when it comes to fighting things like this, pandemics, to addressing natural disasters after countries have been devastated, and we're there to help. So that's my hope for us, is that we can fully be in a place where we can, of course, make sure that our own people, our own citizens and residents are well, but also that we can be a leader among nations to make sure that we eliminate this thing around the world.
Thank you, Congressman. What a great kickoff to our discussion, helping frame a lot of the issues we're going to be now discussing. And I think your constituents are reminded again of the command you have on these issues and the hurdles we face, the challenges we face at home and abroad in tackling this pandemic. So let me just start out there, to talk about our conversation today is going to be on focus on COVID-19, America's role in the global response. And we'll discuss why it matters to our interests and values that we address this pandemic threat at both at home and abroad before opening up to questions from your constituents. Congressman, I want to start with playing a quick video clip for you and to get your reaction right afterwards. Let's take a look at that.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Now, Congressman, that was Bill Gates 5 years ago, warning us we were not ready. And without a doubt, the world is still not ready today. 70% of the world remains unprepared to respond to a pandemic. 10 countries in Africa alone have no ventilators right now. Now, you're no stranger to these issues. You served on the Foreign Affairs Committee since you were first elected to Congress. I guess I want to kick off things by asking, as we address the urgent domestic challenges, why is it in our interest to promote global health security, helping other countries prevent and respond to infectious disease threats?
Well, and you're right. I think the world got caught flat-footed, quite honestly. And you asked the question of why it's important. There is no nation on the face of the earth that has a greater stake and a greater concern for what happens to the people of the world, wherever they are, than the United States of America. There's no nation that is more present in more nations in the world in different ways, including economically, but also in humanitarian concerns, than the United States of America. So from a humanitarian perspective, we want people to be safe and healthy and well. But also from an economic perspective, you see the devastation that not only this country has faced domestically and small businesses down the street closing down, but also the pandemic has affected our trading relationship with nations. In the Texas, you think about the Texas-Mexico border, for example, and the decreased even traffic there with respect to trade. So both for humanitarian concerns and for public safety and humanitarian concerns, but also for economic concerns, we have a very deep interest, a very strong interest in making sure that the people of the world are safe and that they're healthy. And I hope that as we sort out our lessons learned from this, we will figure out how, God forbid this happen. We can expect that something like this will happen at some point in the future, hopefully not anytime soon, but we must figure out how to better coordinate with other nations and with allies our response, so that the effect both on them and on us is mitigated, certainly more than it has been this time. There were mistakes that we did make in terms of not focusing enough of our government apparatus on a pandemic.
And Congressman, USGLC is making this case that as long as the deadly virus is anywhere, Americans are at risk, given how quickly it spreads and how it can always rebound back to our shores. And in fact, we commissioned a national poll to gauge progress and understand American voter attitudes about America's role in fighting the pandemic globally. And what we found from this poll that Morning Consult issued just a couple of weeks ago was that 77% of Americans strongly believe that diseases do not recognize borders and we can't ignore the rest of the world. And those results of the poll overall were overwhelming across the political spectrum. That is, that's a part of all of the facets you talked about, Congressman, about this. Why don't we think about, also turn to national security and think about it through that very specific lens of the challenges. We got to talk about the risk if we don't get this right. As our top military leaders of USGLC said, the co-chairs of our National Security Advisory Council, this was a quote from General Zinni and Admiral Stavridis, no matter how successful we are in fighting the threat of COVID-19 pandemic at home, we will never stop it unless we're also fighting it around the world. So let me turn to that kind of think of that focus on national security. Increased fragility abroad could have serious repercussions for our own safety at home. In extremist attacks in sub-Saharan Africa, have increased by 37% of the past month. The Pentagon has warned of potential resurgence of ISIS in Syria. So I'm asking for you on your seats, both on the Intelligence and Foreign Affairs committees. You are privy to some of the most highest level discussions of U.S. national security concerns. How worried are you about this destabilizing nature of this pandemic, and how can strategic investments, development, diplomacy, and global health help prevent new threats from emerging to America's national security?
Well, as somebody that sits on the Intelligence Committee, as Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm very concerned. The pandemic has been a very destabilizing force for the United States, but also for nations around the world. And what it creates is a certain vacuum. It creates an opportunity for wrongdoers, for those who would abuse the moment to then move in, whether it may be terrorists, whether it could be ISIS, whether it's an authoritarian figure, as I've mentioned before, or others, or those who are operating in cyberspace and see this as an opportunity to commit crime and get away with it, or to affect elections and get away with it. This is a moment where those folks may try to seize upon to essentially carry out their goals. So that's another reason that we have to be very aggressive in defeating COVID-19, not only in the United States, but also around the world. I think it's also important to remark on the obvious, which is the United States is an open country. It's a place where people come and go. You know, we all know the saying that it's a nation that was built on immigrants. It continues to be that. But it's also a place where a lot of people, even if they're not going to move here, people are coming and going to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, many other places around the country all the time. So it's an open society, and that's how we like it, right? But it also brings with it certain health risks, because you've got people from every corner of the globe who are coming and interacting with us all the time. And so that's why it's important to deal with it, not just here, but in other places as well.
It's your remarks too. If we have to solve it all across our country. If a part of our country is still suffering, we can't have finished our job. And if a part of the world is still being overwhelmed by the virus, we aren't safe either, because it moves and it doesn't stop until we've addressed it everywhere. And that's I think the parallel that public opinion survey showed, that Americans get that too. They understand it's a global challenge. It's not only a national one where we can rest easy once we've addressed it here at home. You brought up the economy earlier, and I think it's another important point to return to. I know we have many who have joined us today on our call who export overseas, do business abroad. But unfortunately, as you said, COVID-19 has upended business as usual here and around the world. We're facing the worst economic crisis we face since the Great Depression. over 36 million unemployed at home. The IMF predicts the global economy could lose 9 trillion in GDP over the next 2 years. So we see COVID-19 demonstrating how interconnected our world is and how America's economy depends on global engagement. Texas is the largest exporting state in the country, and 50% of U.S. exports go to emerging markets, which we know are going to be devastated by this pandemic. Can you speak a little, you talked about this earlier, but can we dive a little deeper into how our own economic future is directly tied to the recovery of emerging markets? So just as we need to recover, we've got to start exporting right there for our businesses and our workers to get there. Why is it critical for the U.S. and our international partners to step in and help and stabilize those markets abroad?
Well, let me give you a very concrete example that affects Texas very directly, which is supply chain issues between the United States and Mexico. There has been not really great coordination between the two nations, for example, on what goods are considered essential. So in other words, which factories is Mexico going to allow to be open, right? They've got to make sure that their own workers are safe, and same thing in the United States. And so to the extent that our supply chains, for example, are interconnected and reliant on each other, if you've got COVID-19 that's still ravaging a nation that you're relying on to produce certain things that you need for your own production, then that becomes, that can stop you cold, can stop your own economic activity. And that's exactly the prospect that we're dealing with. If we allow COVID-19 to flourish in places like Mexico, certainly China. China's had now second lockdowns. They're having to bring people back into lockdown. And we hope obviously that we don't get to that point. But even in Texas, we've had multiple days now where the number of infections has continued to rise. A big part of that is because we're finally doing testing at a greater rate than we were doing in the beginning. But that interconnectedness in supply chains and in the trading of goods, I think is another big reason economically why our businesses, our economy, and our livelihood will depend on the success of ridding COVID-19 of trading partners and nations around the world.
Showing that, that sensitivity that we have and that interconnectedness that was there before this virus and is going to be there until and continues on as we try to address it on the repercussions on both sides of our border. Third way that our USGLC leaders talk about the effects of COVID and our role in the world, of course, is humanitarian. There are important humanitarian consequences beyond the economic and the national security of this pandemic, and important work the U.S. is doing in response. We actually have a chance to turn to your constituents for a quick interactive poll right now. It's going to go up on the screen to see what they see. This is according to one of the world's leading NGOs, the International Rescue Committee, up to how many people in the world's most conflict-affected and fragile states are at risk of contracting COVID-19. So we're looking at the most fragile states, the most conflict-affected. We have 3 choices here from their recent report. Is it 100 million under risk, 500 million, or 1 billion? And you can vote on your screen right now, or your constituents can for the moment, Congressman, and see where they thought this survey, where they thought this report said. So we can get the answer in a second. And the answer is 1 billion at the bottom, and that is where the majority of your constituents said. It's that serious, what we're talking about right now. A staggering and unprecedented humanitarian crisis, also threatening to destabilize many fragile regions. We actually have, one of your constituents joining us today, a friend to welcome Todd Spear to talk a little bit more about America's humanitarian leadership. He's the co-founder of Global Aid Consultants, a San Antonio-based humanitarian NGO that's on the front lines responding to this crisis around the world. Todd, thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and your perspective from your NGO about this challenge that we face around the world.
Wow, I must acknowledge that's pretty powerful to see all these leaders gathered here today speaking out in support of America's response to the global threat of COVID-19 with Congressman Castro. I'm Todd Spear, the co-founder of Global Aid Consultants and a proud member of USGLC's Veterans for Smart Power, and live in San Antonio. Our organization, Global Aid Consultants, works hand in hand with the Department of Defense's Army South, located on Joint Base San Antonio, Fort Sam, Houston. Army South conducts a yearly humanitarian assistance program in coordination with the Department of State to build schools and clinics in different countries throughout Central and South America. Army South constructs the buildings, and we, Global Aid Consultants, provides the infrastructure to make them immediately available for their intended purpose. For example, when a school being built, we provide the school desks, teachers' desks, chalkboards, etc., to make it a complete classroom and immediately ready for use. This year, we are working together in Belize. Before COVID-19, 8 new classrooms were planned to be built to support 4 overcrowded schools and 240 children in a remote part of Belize near the Mexican border. This area is known for organized crime and drug trafficking routes. These schools help some of the most marginalized communities in dangerous areas. Due to the restrictions of COVID-19, now only 2 classrooms that hold 30 children each are currently scheduled to be built under a different program through the U.S. Embassy in Belize. These schools increase local economic opportunity, help decrease crime, decrease migration, which increases Belizean safety and security, and does the same here at home. These classrooms are a bridge to become a modern, productive citizen by providing job skills needed to live safe, healthy, and productive lives, and most importantly, hope for the future of our greatest assets, our children. The impact of COVID-19 could have lasting effects on the security of the United States by directly impacting these programs that take place with our neighbors near the Texas border. American organizations like mine from across the country and right here in Texas are working tirelessly alongside our men and women in the State Department and in uniform to make the world a safer place. Thank you for giving me the time today to tell our story.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Todd.
And I was going to say, I'm envious of your wall back there. Mine's a little more bare. I need to borrow yours.
Yeah, I was concerned. I don't want it to be too distracting, but I didn't know where
No, it looks good.
Some friendly
I'm
Zoom
trying to be like
competition.
Jeff Gates.
Congressman, thank you, Todd, for that very much. And I mean, that's it's great to see San Antonians like this leading around the world for the best of American values too. And Todd referenced our hemisphere in Belize. I think that's a good way, especially to ask you about your expertise there. Our neighbors in Latin America are facing some of the worst outbreaks of COVID-19 in the world, as you know.
Yeah.
Experts predicting the region could see more than 45 million of COVID-19 cases without assistance. You're in your role, chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. You stressed the importance of revitalizing our partnerships in our own hemisphere of support for the region. Why don't you, big picture for us, what are the consequences if we don't step up to the plate and help mitigate this unprecedented humanitarian crisis in our own hemisphere?
Well, first I want to say to Todd and to his organization, thank you for all the incredible work that y'all do and much needed work that you do on behalf of the people of the United States over there to help those folks. You know, one of the things that I was struck by very clearly, it's been probably over a month now, but there was footage on the news of Ecuador. And there's a town in Ecuador, I don't know how many folks saw this, but there was a town in Ecuador where people were dying of COVID-19. And the local government could not send folks to pick up the bodies, basically the equivalent of coroners, to pick up the bodies fast enough. And so folks were having to put the bodies of their relatives often out on the street, and the bodies were laying there for several days before they were being picked up. So for many places in Latin America, that's the devastation. You know, as tough as it's been, and it has been tough on the United States, that's the devastation that's going on over there. And the reason that I started my remarks talking about the moment, the context in which we came into this pandemic, is because you already had in Latin America, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries, people that were fleeing, violence, gang violence, most of it, spurred by drug wars. So gang violence and poverty, very deep poverty, seeking asylum in the United States. And I know that is a very big debate, in our country about how we handle asylum seekers, how you handle folks that want to immigrate in the United States. But I fundamentally believe that most people do not want to walk or trek 1,000 miles from their home country to live somewhere else, even to live in our great country. I think most people, if they could, would want to successfully live and safely live in their home country. And so a big part of the work that we do, that we should do, the kind of work that Todd is doing and others, is to make sure that folks have an infrastructure for safety and also for opportunity in their home countries, that they can have lives there and thrive as individuals and as families, and not have to worry about having their 13-year-old daughter threatened with rape, or their son recruited into a drug gang, and feel as though the only option they have is to flee far away. We don't want that for them. We want a better life for them. And the way that we carry that out is through the US State Department, through USAID, through our NGOs, and through so many wonderful organizations who are doing incredible work.
Excellent point there, Congressman. I want to remind everyone about to turn to you for questions for your constituents. If you want to use the raise hand function, *9 on your phone, enter something in the Q&A chat. We'd be welcome to we're welcome to hear from you. Congressman, just before we hear from your constituents, want to follow up on that point, which is a really important one you made. There's a humanitarian, there's generosity that we have that we want to express for our neighbors in our own hemisphere and around the world. There's also a practical impact right now on the drivers of migration, particularly in the Northern Triangle. You were so focused on before this happened. You talked about what COVID's going to do in these fragile societies to exacerbate all of those qualities, which drove people out of there towards our border, seeking greater stability. Another factor is going to be just our own economic situation here. We had former USTR Ambassador Ron Kirk joining us early in this talk, who knows that about these economic sensitivities. But the practical effect is I've seen estimates that at least 20% of remittances that would be going in our economy at the strongest in the U.S. back to Central America and other places are going to be reduced at least that amount. You're seeing all of these now factors that are going to be, if we can't address and control COVID, they're going to just metastasize and all the other factors that are going on in the Northern Triangle right now.
And I'm glad that you brought up that point on the remittances. Remittances, in other words, you have folks who immigrate to the United States, they make money working here, and they're able to send money back to their families in Mexico or in Central America. Those remittances account for a big percentage, of the money that is being received by an average family, say in El Salvador. And so when people in the United States then are out of work, it has deeply affected how much money is being sent back over there. And then, of course, they're dealing with the pandemic as well, so they're out of work. And so it's been very, very difficult and has destabilized things in many ways.
So true. This has been a great beginning of their conversation. We have some questions already emerging right now. I want to call on Toya Walker to unmute, join us, and ask a question to the Congressman. Toya.
Hello. Thank you so much, Representative Castro. My question is, with a global pandemic, do you think that foreign policy will play a larger role in November, or will it be overshadowed by the economy?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, with this pandemic, I think what you see is a tendency for everybody to kind of hunker down, right? Literally hunker down. People have been with their closest family members. And so I think in some ways, it's similar for a nation. There's an inclination to hunker down and of course, focus on the domestic issues and getting back up on your feet as a country. And to a large extent, I think that's understandable, and you would expect that. But I also think the foreign policy issues are going to play a big role, not just the issues of America's role in the world. I'm going to editorialize here a little bit, so take it for what it's worth. But I do think that our reputation in the world, our standing in terms of how we're perceived in leadership in the world, has taken a blow the last few years. And you've had China that is coming on strong with its Belt and Road Initiative. It's using its masks, for example, in giving away masks to different countries as a form of diplomacy. So it's gotten more aggressive in what they've gotten more aggressive in what they're doing. Russia has also been very aggressive around the world and in cyberspace. So I do think that for the election, I mean, look, people first and foremost want to make sure that our country is okay domestically. However, we can't lose sight of the very important issues around foreign policy and our leadership in the world, where we stand in the world, because like I said, it all comes down to, I think, fundamentally, at least those three things: freedom, democracy, and human rights. There is another version of another idea of what the world could look like, what governance in other countries could look like, that is harsher, that is more authoritarian, that is less free. And there's certainly other countries, and really not just one or two, but other countries that if they were in stronger positions around the world, if they were more present around the world as the United States is, the world would look, I think, or could look significantly different.
Congressman, in response to Toya's question, you raised China too, which is, we talk about an issue that may have a great resonance in the fall. It is China. I mean, China's and you actually talked about them early in your remarks too, I remember. There's so much at the center of this right now, the center of where the virus emerged, but also, as you've said, they've been recovering from the virus themselves and dealing with it, they've also been continuing, if not stepping up, their engagement with the developing world, where
Right.
we're so focused on right now about where our leadership's going to be. And as pre-COVID and during this crisis right now, China isn't waiting for us to step into the breach.
Right.
They're filling that vacuum, and whether it's protective equipment for those countries, loan guarantees that are questionable sometimes in Africa and Latin America, but they are everywhere right now. And that's a question of, if we aren't filling that gap of leadership to help out as we address it here at home as well, abroad, China and others are going to be filling that vacuum, aren't they?
No, that's absolutely right. And I think, you see China especially aggressive with developing nations because they're trying to get in on the ground floor, so to speak, in Africa, in Latin America, but also, quite frankly, making inroads with some of our staunchest allies in Europe. There's an article this week on Israel and Israel and the United States. Secretary Pompeo went not too long ago to Israel, and some tension over how much Israel is going to rely on Chinese infrastructure, right? And they're working on a port project over there, and so yeah, you're in a full competitive mode with a country that's got just a very different outlook about how to do things. And I said before all this pandemic that the fundamental challenge with China, it's our number one trading partner, right? So we're doing economically a lot with China. But we have to figure out, how do you allow China to compete without allowing them to cheat? I believe that in the United States, as Americans, we can compete and win against any nation in the world. Our folks, our businesses, what we do, I believe that if we can fairly compete, we can win, right? We can't always win if you have countries that are cheating in what they do. And so that's, I think, where we have to be careful with China. And I'm not saying they're cheating at every single thing, but certainly if you think about issues that we've had with intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and other challenges. And then one last thing, because I think it's important, on human rights, their treatment of the Uyghurs there, and the fact that that's been wrapped in secrecy and no accountability is extremely concerning for the world and disturbing in terms of the reports that we've seen come out of there.
Yeah. We focus a lot on the development challenges we need to address this, the global health ones. There's a diplomatic side of this too, not only sometimes adversarial, a challenge that we have with China, with our own allies as well, to get intel, to come up with joint solutions, vaccine research, all those things that are going to be multilateral too, showing all the dimensions of the work you oversee in Congress. Got a question submitted by Cliff Paredes, who focuses on, I think, on some of the issues we're talking about earlier. The COVID-19 pandemic, I'm reading his question, has caused an unprecedented disruption in the global economy that unduly impacts the small business sector. How can the U.S. provide global leadership in promoting the growth and sustainability of the small business sector in other countries that can reduce the root causes of crime and migration while opening markets for U.S. small businesses?
That's our small business development around the world, and especially in the developing world, is arguably, I mean, probably the first or second most important thing that you can do, aside from the immediate triaging, so to speak, of groups of people, making sure that they're okay, right? Building an infrastructure where people can build their own businesses and sustain themselves economically, so that they can sustain themselves and their families, and hopefully eventually employ other people in their work. That is fundamental to the success of other nations in the developing world. And we're very fortunate in San Antonio. The UTSA Small Business Center has been one of the groups that literally has worked in different parts of the world on behalf of the United States government and done exactly that. Gone to different places of the world and basically helped create small business entrepreneurs, people who are at the leading, the forefront of growing business in their own countries. And that's what we want to see. We want to see people be able to prosper at home, employ people at home in their home countries. And then that I think relieves some of the issues of migration, because you don't have as much desperation. And as I mentioned, I fundamentally believe that these folks, if they could make it at home and they weren't in danger and they were safe, they would stay at home.
Absolutely. Got a question. I think someone's raised their hand. We have a live question from Homer Erickson. Homer, I see you there at the screen. Please ask your question to the Congressman.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for doing this again, Representative Castro. Actually, a professor of economics at TCU. So really a couple of questions. I know we've had to have two large stimulus acts, and we needed to have those for stability, short-run stability of the economy. As you know, when FDR did the New Deal, there were two aspects. I mean, one was clearly the public works program and what happened there. But he also, as you know, really had good neighbor policies that supported particularly Latin America and the Western Hemisphere at the time.
Right.
So as we go forward in thinking about what we do, and I really liked your comments about the interconnection between our local employment, domestic employment, and what it means for the international. Why are we not looking again at the next stimulus package that we're going to have clearly, looking at if you will, maybe a public works program and or a additional private small business works program as significant parts of that to again strengthen the domestic economy and really address some of the unemployment problems we have right now?
No, and that's a great question. And you're right. And there was discussion early on about making infrastructure a big part of the recovery package, and the discussion really started, now probably 6 or 7 weeks ago. And I think people felt like it was too early at that point because people were being laid off from work, and so there was just an immediacy to get direct assistance, financial assistance into people's hands, and unemployment benefits. But as we go forward, I think what you'll see is a greater focus on public works, on infrastructure. And I also think that there's a chance that we move beyond the model of the PPP program, which is the largest small business relief program, and that we move to some other model. And so I think that, to answer your question, I think there's an opportunity for that in the coming pieces of legislation. Folks have asked, how many more rounds of legislation do you think there will be from Congress? We've already had several. I think there's at least got to be one more. That's my sense based on the numbers that I've seen, the discussion in Congress, the chatter, so to speak. I think that there's got to be at least one more round after this one that just passed the House. And hopefully it includes some of the things that you talked about.
And something thank you for that question too, Homer. And obviously this, our leaders around the country and this organization was watching the international response, and we were concerned that wasn't in the House package itself,
right,
despite your leadership and others. And we really, we see that as really being a key to a part of this response, but a key part for hopefully comes back from the Senate and can be included in conference as well, because that's something that's really critical to address all these issues we talked about in the international front too. Got a question. I had one a second ago from Robin. Eloise actually submitted one. Eloise Sutherland submitted one as well. Let's go to this one. How do we go about making sure the U.S. provides help to low-income countries to fight COVID-19 and continue making progress in fighting other infectious diseases? Definitely something we've discussed throughout this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the humanitarian aspect, the role that we've always played when, in both in past pandemics, but also natural disasters and other events, other tragedies. That's where we should be able to supply people masks and ventilators.
Yeah.
There's no reason that countries in Africa should be completely without some of the vital supplies that they need. So we should be able to do that, and we should do it, both because it's the right thing to do, but also because that's the leadership role that we have played in the past and that we should play now and in the future.
Yeah, I mean, chilling report at the end of last week showing COVID emerging in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. Over 1 million, the largest collective refugee camps in the world. When you start thinking about those vulnerable populations, I mean, this is everything we've talked about. It's humanitarian, it's national security, it is economic in those places, but the disruption, Syria, Bangladesh, those refugee camps start getting infected. There is so little protection they have there. And that's a case where things go from bad to worse very quickly.
No, you're right. I mean, there again, you have a group of people that are persecuted that migrate over to another country away from their homes, and they're living in squalor. We had this similar concerns with the Central American migrants from the Northern Triangle who were up in Matamoros, in shabby tent camps made from garbage bags. And look, there are certain places where people are living closely together, and we've seen, or around each other a lot, whether it's the naval ship that was infected, the naval ships, the cruise ships, nursing homes, prisons, detention centers in the United States, and also migrant camps in different parts of the world, including the Rohingya. And so the United States, working with ASEAN and working with Japan, because Japan's been very active on the Rohingya issue, we should be able to be helpful there. I think that's exactly the kind of work that we should be doing, is to be helpful to folks who are in very vulnerable positions right now.
Our time is drawing. This has been a great conversation. Our time is drawing close. We've got one last question before we go to you, Congressman, to wrap up. Robin Lerner back on the line and wanted to ask you a question. Robin, please ask your question to Congressman Castro. Do we have you?
So you're on mute, maybe?
I see you're coming up now. Robin, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Congressman Castro, thank you so much for your time. I really have many questions, but one of the things that I worry about most is that those of us who feel that global preparedness for these kinds of pandemics is something we have to remain vigilant about, have concerns that there will be portions of our population that will say that this was crying wolf and that this wasn't as bad as it was portended to be, and the economic downfall will be something that they will then raise over the heads of anybody running for Congress who in the future, or running for office in the fall, who really supports global preparedness and efforts to stay firm on that. So when you can't really measure a disaster that didn't happen and show voters that actually we got really lucky. So how do you remain vigilant on that and actually keep the support alive for global preparedness efforts?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And in your question, I think you allude to something that I regret, and I think a lot of us regret that we've seen, which is the politicization of this pandemic. And you're right. I do think that there will be folks who say, hey, the death toll didn't end up at 500,000 or 300,000, or, now we don't know. It's not over. I mean, 90,000 Americans have died. And, I expect just based on the trajectories that you'll have tens of thousands more who will, just based on, what's going on with the virus right now. But yeah, I think that you will have some politicization of that, unfortunately. But remember, part of the reason that it didn't hit us as hard is because Americans sacrificed. I mean, for 2 months, there were many people who barely came out of their homes, people that were out of work. They lost their jobs and they were staying home. But for those measures, then the death toll would have been a lot higher. So it was because of our reaction that saved, I think, many lives. Now, I do take issue with some of the steps that are being taken to open back up in some places where, the virus is still ravaging the population. And we have to be very vigilant about a second spike here in the, later in the summer or in the fall. Again, this is a case of first impression. By that, I mean, as you know, this is a new virus for us. We haven't dealt with it before. And because there's no vaccine for it, it's kind of a double hit. But, I think we just have to make the point that, or I guess many of us will make the point that from the lessons learned for next time, we can be better prepared both as a nation and as a world, and that we can be better coordinated in our response. And I think, hopefully all of us will take those lessons to heart.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Robin, for the question. Congressman, it's been an outstanding discussion today. It's been a heavy discussion, though, too. We talked about some really weighty issues. So why don't I think about, for your close, to try and end on a positive note and ask you kind of what keeps you going in these uncertain times? What gives you hope that we can rise the challenge of stopping the spread of COVID-19 at home and abroad, rebuild our economy, providing hope, ending on a hopeful note for your constituents as we close out today's discussion?
I think a big part of what's given me hope is when I see Americans all over the country helping each other out, people volunteering, people giving, whatever dollars they can to help families that are in need, people coming together to celebrate important milestones like graduations. You see these folks that are doing, driving by people's homes to celebrate birthdays and graduations and other ceremonies. That's been very special to see, and it gives you a sense of the strong American spirit. And then also when I hear about people around the world who are benefiting from America's help, who are benefiting from our ingenuity, our innovation, from the things that American business and entrepreneurs have created, that's very hopeful. But, the way I would put it is this. We're fortunate that during this pandemic, we live, I think, in the United States of America, that we still live in what is the most prosperous and powerful nation on earth. And all of us need to make sure that when you ask the question 50 years from now of somebody who's living halfway around the world, where on earth they'd want to go if they were going to leave their home country, that the answer is still what it's been for generations, which is the United States of America. And I still believe that we can make it so.
That gives us hope, Congressman, and you give hope to the constituents, to your constituents who have heard again for an hour of how fortunate they are to have you representing them in Congress.
Oh, thank you.
With the leadership you provide on such a host of issues, a range of issues, domestic and America's role in the world and leadership across that, how fortunate they are. So thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation today, an important one that we have, timely. And I want to turn it over to conclude our program today to my colleague, Troy Williams, our the Southwest Outreach Director for USGLC, to close and give a brief call to action. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you.
Troy.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Congressman Castro, for this engaging conversation during this pivotal moment and for your unwavering support of America's global leadership, especially at such a critical time. Also, special thank you to Todd Spear of Global Aid Consultants for sharing his insight, as well as our program partners, Global Chamber of San Antonio, World Affairs Council of San Antonio, and San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your support. We are so appreciative that each of you joined us today, and to thank Representative Castro, including our advisory committee members and our veterans for Smart Power. USGLC regularly updates you on what is happening here in Texas. You should have received a few updates this past week. If you haven't, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. We want to make sure that you're on our mailing list and that you stay up to date on all the information that you need to know about USGLC and what's happening with the HEAL. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your positions is critical to keep America's leadership around the globe strong so that we can protect our economic interests, our national security, and our humanitarian values. Your voice makes all the difference. For up-to-the-minute updates, please follow us on Twitter and definitely join us for our upcoming virtual events. Thank you again for your support during these difficult times. I enjoy hearing from you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. Please be safe and stay well.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Take
San
care.
Antonio.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.